At 4:37 in the morning on August 9, 1943, Senior Sergeant Viktor Andreevich Volkov lay in a drainage ditch 300 meters from the NKVD compound in Kursk, watching two guards smoke cigarettes outside the motor pool gate. He had a Mosin Nagant rifle with a PU scope, 17 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition, and a list of 12 names written on a scrap of German requisition paper that he'd carried for 9 months. The first name on that list was Captain Dmitry Sokolov, NKVD 3rd Directorate, currently standing 20 feet from the motor pool entrance, exhaling smoke into the pre-dawn fog. In the next 90 seconds, Volkov would squeeze the trigger and begin a killing spree that would take 3 weeks to complete and 60 years to understand. The official Soviet military record listed Viktor Volkov as a traitor executed by firing squad on September 4, 1943. The German Wehrmacht intelligence files listed him as Obergefreiter Hans Volkov, attached sniper, 11 confirmed eliminations of Soviet officers between November 1942 and July 1943. The truth, buried in archives that wouldn't be opened until 2003, was considerably more complicated. Viktor Volkov was born in 1921 in a village outside Voronezh, where his father worked as a forester and taught Viktor to shoot deer at 200 meters before he turned 12. The boy had steady hands and good eyes and the kind of patience that makes natural hunters. When the Great Patriotic War began in June 1941, Viktor was 20 years old and working at a sawmill. He enlisted in July because everyone was enlisting, because the Germans were 50 kilometers from Moscow by October, and because men who didn't volunteer were asked uncomfortable questions about their patriotism. He went through 6 weeks of basic training that mostly involved marching and political education, received a rifle he'd fired exactly once during qualification, and was assigned to the 308th Rifle Division in November 1941. By January 1942, he'd seen enough combat to know that most Soviet tactics consisted of sending waves of men forward until the Germans ran out of ammunition or the Soviets ran out of men, whichever came first. It was not scientific, it was not efficient, it was simply arithmetic with a very high casualty rate. A lieutenant named Gorev noticed that Viktor never missed during the few times they had ammunition for target practice. Gorev sent him to sniper school in February 1942. The school was a 2-week course in a building that had been a schoolhouse before the war and was now full of men learning to kill other men from distances where you could see their faces clearly through a scope. They taught him about windage and bullet drop and how to estimate range using a man's head as a reference point. They taught him to build hides from rubble and snow and to wait for hours without moving until the perfect shot presented itself. They gave him a PU scope and told him that a good sniper was worth 10 riflemen because he killed officers and specialists and created fear in the enemy ranks. Viktor was very good at it. By May 1942, he had 43 confirmed eliminations, a medal, and a promotion to sergeant. By September, he had 67 and another medal. By November, he had 81, and a growing suspicion that something was fundamentally wrong with how the war was being fought. The problem wasn't the Germans. The Germans were the enemy, and killing them made tactical sense. The problem was the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, which was technically a police organization, but functioned as Stalin's personal instrument for maintaining absolute control through absolute terror. NKVD officers were attached to every Soviet unit at company level and above. Their job was not to fight Germans. Their job was to shoot Soviet soldiers who retreated without orders, who questioned orders, who were suspected of defeatism or insufficient enthusiasm for the communist cause. They had legal authority to execute anyone on the spot. They used it constantly. Viktor watched it happen for the first time on October 7th, 1942. His unit was retreating from a German counterattack near Stalingrad. The retreat was orderly, covered by rearguard machine gun positions exactly according to the tactical manual. But Captain Sokolov of the NKVD 3rd Directorate decided it was unauthorized. He pulled his pistol and shot Lieutenant Gorev in the back of the head in front of the entire company. Gorev fell face down in the mud. Sokolov announced that anyone else who retreated without his personal authorization would receive the same. The company held position. 40 men died in the next 3 hours because retreating to a defensible position would have required Sokolov's permission, and Sokolov was more interested in demonstrating his power than in preserving lives. Viktor was 200 meters away in a sniper hide when it happened. He watched through his scope as Gorev died. Gorev had been a decent officer who knew how to read terrain and when to withdraw. Gorev had sent Viktor to sniper school. Gorev had shared his tobacco and talked about his wife in Leningrad and never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. And Sokolov had executed him for following basic military doctrine. Viktor put Sokolov in his crosshairs and held him there for maybe 5 seconds. One squeeze, that's all it would take. Blame it on a German sniper. Fog of war. Unfortunate accident. But there were witnesses. The entire company had seen Sokolov shoot Gorev. If Sokolov died immediately after from a Soviet sniper rifle, the NKVD would execute half the company looking for the shooter. So Viktor did nothing. He watched Sokolov walk away. He carved Gorev's initials into his rifle stock, which was where he kept count of the people who mattered. The second incident happened on November 3rd, 1942. Private Yuri Karpov was 19 years old from a village near Tula. He'd been in Viktor's unit for 6 weeks. Good kid. Wrote letters to his mother. Shared his bread. During a German artillery barrage, Karpov's nerve broke. He ran. Not far, maybe 50 meters, just enough to get away from the shells that were tearing up the trench line. Commissar Berezhkov, NKVD, saw him run. Berezhkov was 25 years old, university-educated, son of a party official. He'd never been in combat before his NKVD assignment. He shot Karpov as the boy tried to crawl back to the trench. 2 rounds in the back. Karpov died slowly, screaming for his mother, while Berezhkov lectured the survivors about cowardice and the importance of revolutionary discipline. Viktor was in a position 300 meters north. He watched it happen. He put Berezhkov in his scope, held him, imagined the trigger pull, did nothing, carved Karpov's initials into his rifle stock. By mid-November, Viktor had a list, not written down, just memorized. 7 names. NKVD officers who had executed Soviet soldiers for infractions that ranged from unauthorized retreat to insufficient enthusiasm during a political lecture. 7 men who wore NKVD uniforms and carried pistols and had never fired a shot at Germans, but had killed 23 Soviet soldiers in the 6 months Viktor had been watching. He started to understand that the real enemy wasn't just the Germans. The real enemy was anyone who treated Soviet lives as disposable resources to be expended in service of their own power. And he started to think about what would happen if someone with a rifle and a scope decided to do something about it. The decision came on November 19th, 1942. Viktor's company was preparing for an assault on a German strongpoint. The attack was suicidal. Everyone knew it. The Germans held a fortified position with interlocking machine gun fire and pre-sighted artillery. Soviet doctrine said to assault anyway because Soviet lives were infinite and German ammunition was not. Captain Sokolov, still very much alive, called the company together for a pre-assault speech about duty and sacrifice and the inevitability of communist victory. Halfway through the speech, a sergeant named Mikhailov raised his hand. Mikhailov was 31, a veteran of Finland, smart enough to see the obvious. He asked whether it might be more effective to wait for artillery support or to probe for a weak point, rather than assault directly into prepared defenses. Sokolov smiled. He walked over to Mikhailov. He asked if anyone else agreed with the sergeant's cowardly suggestion. 3 men raised their hands. Sokolov shot Mikhailov and the 3 others right there, 4 shots in maybe 6 seconds, and announced that the assault would proceed as planned, with or without cowards. The assault went ahead. 60 men advanced, 17 came back. German machine guns killed most of them. Sokolov wrote a report crediting the attack's failure to insufficient fighting spirit among the men. Viktor didn't participate in the assault. Snipers operated independently, often outside the direct chain of command. He watched from a position 500 meters east. He watched Mikhailov die. He watched the assault fail. He watched Sokolov write his report, sitting in a dugout with a bottle of vodka, while medics carried wounded men past his position. And Viktor made a decision that would define the rest of his short life. He couldn't kill the NKVD officers. Not here. Not as a Soviet soldier. The NKVD would investigate, they'd find him, they'd execute him, and probably a dozen other soldiers just to make a point. But if he wasn't a Soviet soldier anymore, if he was someone else, somewhere else, then maybe the rules would be different. On November 21st, 1942, Senior Sergeant Viktor Volkov walked into German lines and surrendered. He'd planned it for 2 days. He chose a sector held by Wehrmacht regular army, not SS, because regular army took prisoners. He left his rifle behind but kept the scope, disassembled and hidden in his coat. He approached at dawn, hands raised, shouting the only German words he knew. "Nicht schießen." Don't shoot. A patrol from the 294th Infantry Division captured him. They searched him, found the scope, got very interested. A lieutenant who spoke Russian asked why a Soviet sniper was surrendering. Viktor told him the truth. He told him about Gorev and Karpov and Mikhailov. He told him about 7 NKVD officers who executed Soviet soldiers for retreating or questioning orders or showing insufficient enthusiasm. He told the lieutenant that he wanted to kill those men, but couldn't do it as a Soviet soldier. The lieutenant didn't believe him. Prisoners said anything to avoid being shot, but the intelligence officer at division headquarters was more thoughtful. Major Ernst Dietrich had been an intelligence officer since 1939. He'd interrogated hundreds of Soviet prisoners. Most of them were terrified, hungry, eager to cooperate in exchange for food. A few were fanatics who wouldn't talk. Viktor was different. Viktor was calm. Viktor had a list of names, ranks, and units memorized. Viktor could describe the Soviet positions around Stalingrad in detail because he'd been observing them through a scope for 6 months. Viktor could also shoot, which Dietrich confirmed by having him demonstrate on a rifle range. At 200 meters, Viktor put 5 rounds into a circle the size of a fist. At 300 meters, he put 3 rounds through the same target. Dietrich recognized talent when he saw it. He also recognized an opportunity. A Soviet sniper who wanted to kill NKVD officers was potentially useful. Dietrich made Viktor an offer. Work for German intelligence. Sniper work, targeted eliminations, officers and commissars. In exchange, the Germans would get him close to his targets and provide whatever support he needed. Viktor agreed immediately. From November 1942 to July 1943, Viktor Volkov operated as a German asset attached to the 294th Infantry Division. The Germans gave him a uniform, forged papers identifying him as Obergefreiter Hans Volkov, ethnically German from the Volga region, and a degree of freedom that most German soldiers didn't enjoy. He wasn't required to participate in regular operations. He didn't answer to company commanders. He worked directly with Dietrich's intelligence section, and his job was simple: identify and eliminate Soviet officers who were valuable enough that their deaths would impact morale or operations. The Germans didn't care about his personal vendetta against the NKVD. They cared about results. Viktor gave them results. 11 confirmed eliminations between December 1942 and July 1943. A battalion commander at 400 meters, a political officer at 300, an artillery spotter at 520. Each shot carefully planned, carefully executed. The Germans were pleased. They promoted him to Obergefreiter, which didn't mean much but gave him more freedom of movement. They provided better equipment, better rations, and detailed intelligence about Soviet positions, and Viktor used that intelligence to track the 7 names on his list. Captain Dmitry Sokolov, NKVD 3rd Directorate, the man who had shot Lieutenant Gorev, was now stationed at a compound in Kursk. Commissar Pyotr Berezhkov, who had killed Private Karpov, was assigned to a training facility near Voronezh. Lieutenant Alexei Morozov, who had executed 2 soldiers for complaining about the quality of their rations, was attached to a rifle division near Belgorod. Viktor found them all. He found them using German intelligence networks and Soviet prisoner interrogations and patient observation. By July 1943, he had locations, routines, and vulnerabilities for 7 NKVD officers. What he didn't have was access. The men on his list were not serving at the front where a German sniper could reach them. They were in rear areas, surrounded by Soviet security, and killing them would require getting back behind Soviet lines. In July 1943, Viktor told Major Dietrich that he needed to return to the Red Army. Dietrich thought he was insane. Defectors didn't return. The NKVD executed defectors after interrogations that made death look like mercy. But Viktor had a plan. He'd been a prisoner for 8 months. He'd been broken out of a POW camp by Soviet partisans, a story that was plausible because partisan raids on German prison camps were common. The partisans had smuggled him back to Soviet lines. He'd endured German captivity, remained loyal, and was ready to resume fighting. The story had enough truth to be believable and enough gaps that interrogators couldn't easily verify details. Dietrich listened to the plan and saw its genius. If Viktor could get back into Soviet service, he could eliminate targets that German intelligence wanted dead and satisfy his personal vendetta simultaneously. Dietrich arranged the defection. On July 23, 1943, Viktor walked out of German lines near Orel, was captured by a Soviet patrol, and told his story. The NKVD interrogated him for 9 days. They beat him. They asked the same questions in different orders, looking for inconsistencies. They threatened to execute him as a collaborator. Viktor stuck to his story. He'd been captured. He'd been held at a prison camp near Smolensk. Partisans had raided the camp. He'd escaped during the chaos. He had no useful intelligence about German positions because he'd been locked in a camp. He hadn't collaborated because he'd had no opportunity. The interrogators wanted to shoot him anyway, but the Red Army was desperately short of experienced soldiers in July 1943 after massive losses at Kursk. Viktor was an experienced sniper with 81 confirmed eliminations before his capture. The decision was made to return him to service under close observation. By August 1, 1943, Viktor was back in uniform. They assigned him to a rifle division near Kursk, not his old unit, and they attached an NKVD minder who was supposed to watch for signs of disloyalty. Viktor was patient. He performed his duties. He eliminated German targets when ordered. He showed the appropriate enthusiasm for Soviet victory, and he waited for his opportunity. It came on August 8th, when his unit rotated to a rear area for resupply. The NKVD compound where Captain Sokolov was stationed was 3 kilometers from Viktor's bivouac area. Viktor volunteered for perimeter security duty, a boring assignment that put him in a position with a rifle and minimal supervision. At 4:15 in the morning on August 9th, Viktor left his post. He moved through the pre-dawn darkness to a drainage ditch 300 meters from the NKVD compound. He had his Mosin Nagant, 17 rounds, and the list he'd been carrying in his head for 9 months. First name on the list was Captain Dmitry Sokolov. Sokolov appeared at 4:37. He walked out of the compound motor pool with another officer, both of them smoking, discussing something Viktor couldn't hear. Viktor settled into the shooting position he'd been trained to use. Breathe out, between heartbeats, squeeze. The rifle cracked. Sokolov dropped. The other officer looked around confused, trying to locate the shot. Viktor worked the bolt, acquired the second target, fired again. 2 shots, 2 bodies, 14 seconds. He moved immediately. By the time NKVD security responded to the shooting, Viktor was 400 meters away, moving through a construction site. He ditched the rifle in a pile of rubble, returned to his unit's area, and was back at his post by 5:30. When the NKVD investigated, they found 2 dead officers and no immediate suspects. The shots had come from outside the compound. The shooter had used a Soviet rifle. The obvious conclusion was German infiltrators or partisans, both of which were plausible in August 1943. Name 2 on the list was Commissar Pyotr Berezhkov. He was harder to reach because he was at a training facility with tighter security. Viktor couldn't approach during the day, and the facility was lit at night. He watched for 3 days, learning routines. Berezhkov had a habit of walking the perimeter fence at dawn, inspecting guard positions, making notes. On August 13th, Viktor positioned himself in a tree line 600 meters from the fence. It was a difficult shot, long range, crosswind, moving target. He took it at 6:12 in the morning when Berezhkov paused to light a cigarette. 1 shot. Berezhkov fell. Viktor was gone before anyone reached the body. Name 3 was Lieutenant Alexei Morozov. He died on August 17th at 340 meters while inspecting a supply convoy. Name 4 was Senior Lieutenant Boris Kravchenko, who'd ordered the execution of a soldier for falling asleep on guard duty. He died on August 20th. Name 5 was Captain Ivan Petrov. August 23rd. Name 6 was Commissar Nikolai Ivanov. August 26th. By late August, the NKVD had noticed a pattern. 7 of their officers dead in 3 weeks, all killed by long-range rifle fire, all in rear areas where German snipers shouldn't be operating. They launched a massive investigation. They interrogated soldiers. They reviewed personnel files. They looked for German infiltrators or partisan networks. What they didn't look for was a Soviet sniper with a personal grudge, because that seemed impossible. Names 7 through 12 were harder because by September, the NKVD was taking precautions. Officers traveled with guards. They varied their routines. They avoided predictable patterns. Viktor adapted. He waited longer. He took riskier shots. He accepted that he might not get all 12. On August 29th, he killed Name 7, Major Stepan Orlov, through a window at 410 meters. On September 1st, he killed Names 8 and 9, both commissars attached to the same unit, with 2 shots in 11 seconds. Name 10 died on September 2nd, Name 11 on September 3rd. And on the morning of September 4th, 1943, Viktor positioned himself to kill the 12th and final name on his list, Colonel Grigory Volinsky, NKVD, the man who had created the policy that NKVD officers could execute Soviet soldiers without trial or review. Volinsky was the reason Gorev and Karpov and Mikhailov and 20 others had died. He was the architect of the system Viktor was dismantling one bullet at a time. Viktor had him in the scope at 7:23 in the morning. Volinsky was 400 meters away, walking across a parade ground surrounded by 6 guards. It was a nearly impossible shot because of the distance and the protection. But Viktor had been making impossible shots for 2 years. He breathed out, waited between heartbeats, squeezed. The rifle cracked. Volinsky went down. The guards scattered. Viktor worked the bolt for a second shot, but there was no target. He'd done it. 12 names, 3 weeks, all dead. He felt nothing. No satisfaction, no relief, just the empty recognition that the thing he'd set out to do was finished. He walked back toward his unit's position, knowing that the NKVD would find him soon. They'd been closing in for days. His minder had reported unusual activity. Other soldiers had noticed his absences. It was only a matter of time. They arrested him at 9:15 on September 4th. 6 NKVD officers with pistols drawn. They found his rifle, recently fired, poorly hidden. They found the scrap of German paper with 12 names, all crossed out. They didn't bother with a formal interrogation. Colonel Volinsky was dead. 11 other NKVD officers were dead, all killed by the same rifle in the same time period. Viktor didn't deny it. He told them everything: the defection, the return, the list, the kills. He told them about Gorev and Karpov and Mikhailov. He told them that the NKVD had killed more Soviet soldiers than he'd killed NKVD officers, and that maybe they should think about that. They shot him at 4:30 in the afternoon. Firing squad, 6 rifles, no ceremony. The official record listed him as a traitor and collaborator executed for crimes against the Soviet state. His name was erased from the division's roll of honor. The 81 German soldiers he'd killed as a Soviet sniper were attributed to other men. Viktor Andreevich Volkov ceased to exist officially. The truth stayed buried for 60 years. In 2003, Russian military historians researching NKVD operations during the Great Patriotic War found classified files in the state archive. The files documented 12 NKVD officer deaths in August and September 1943, all initially attributed to German special operations or partisan activity. But one file, marked for permanent classification, contained interrogation transcripts and a detailed investigation report. The investigation had concluded that the killer was Viktor Volkov, a Soviet sniper who had defected to the Germans and returned with a personal vendetta. What the historians also found, buried in German intelligence archives that had been captured by the Soviets in 1945, were Major Dietrich's operational reports. Dietrich had documented Viktor's defection, his service with German intelligence, and his planned return to Soviet lines. But Dietrich's reports included something the Soviet investigators hadn't known. Viktor had been a double agent. His defection had been planned. His service with the Germans had been a cover. His real mission was to gain access to intelligence about NKVD locations and operations so he could eliminate officers who were murdering Soviet soldiers. Dietrich had known this and hadn't cared because Viktor was also killing Soviet officers the Germans wanted dead. It had been a marriage of convenience. Viktor got German intelligence support. The Germans got 11 dead Soviet officers. Everyone won except the NKVD. The historians published their findings in 2005. The report concluded that Viktor Volkov had been neither a traitor nor a hero, but something more complicated. He'd been a soldier who saw his own leadership killing more of his comrades than the enemy was, and decided to do something about it using the only tools and skills available to him. Whether that made him a patriot or a murderer depended on which set of values you used to judge him. The Red Army's values in 1943 said he was a traitor. Modern values, with 6 decades of perspective on Stalin's terror, suggested he might have been right. In 2007, the Russian government quietly rehabilitated Viktor's military record. They didn't call him a hero. They didn't restore his name to the division honors. They simply removed the traitor designation and acknowledged that the circumstances of his case were complicated. His family, what remained of it, received a letter explaining that new evidence had come to light and that Viktor Andreevich Volkov had served the Soviet Union in ways that were only now being fully understood. There's a photograph in the State Archive now. It shows Viktor in his Red Army uniform, taken sometime in early 1942, before everything went wrong. He's 21 years old with steady eyes and the slight build of someone who spent his youth hunting in forests. He's holding a Mosin Nagant rifle. If you look very closely at the rifle stock, you can see the beginnings of what would become a very long list of initials. Some of those initials belong to German soldiers he killed as a Soviet sniper. Some belong to Soviet soldiers murdered by the NKVD officers he later hunted. And somewhere, not photographed, not documented, not part of any official record, are the 12 names he carried for 9 months and eliminated one by one in 3 weeks during the summer of 1943. The rifle is lost. The list is preserved in the archive. The man who carried both is officially rehabilitated and unofficially forgotten. Sometimes that's exactly right. Sometimes the most complicated stories are the ones nobody wants to tell.